The harsh Montana winter had finally released its grip on the land, but for Eleanor Winters, the journey west felt colder than any blizzard she'd endured back in Boston. As the stagecoach rattled over the uneven terrain, she clutched the worn photograph of Thomas Sullivan, her soon-to-be husband, and wondered if she'd made the gravest mistake of her life. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Final stop, Pinewood Creek. The driver's voice cut through her thoughts. Eleanor gathered her meager belongings, heart pounding against her ribs. After 3 months of letters, she was about to meet the man who had promised her a life of comfort on his thriving cattle ranch. But as she stepped down onto the dusty road, her eyes widened at the plume of black smoke rising from the direction described in Thomas's letters. A local shopkeeper approached, his face grim. "You must be the mail-order bride," he said, voice heavy with something Eleanor couldn't place. "I'm afraid you've arrived in nothing but ashes, miss." What the shopkeeper couldn't tell her was that someone was watching from the tree line, a figure shrouded in shadow with eyes the same piercing blue as the man in her photograph. Thomas's brother, Daniel Sullivan, hadn't spoken more than 10 words to anyone in over 5 years. But as he observed the woman his brother had sent for, something stirred within him that he'd long thought dead. Neither Eleanor nor Daniel could have predicted how their lives would intertwine from the ashes of broken promises, or the dangerous secrets that had turned the Sullivan Ranch to cinders in the first place. Montana Territory, 1885. Eleanor Winters had always prided herself on pragmatism. At 26, with no prospects in Boston and her father's mounting medical debts threatening to consume what little they had left, answering Thomas Sullivan's advertisement in the Matrimonial Gazette had seemed the only sensible choice. Established ranchers seeks educated, resilient wife to share in prosperity and build a family in Montana Territory. His letters had been straightforward yet kind, describing lush pastures, a sturdy 2-story home, and the promise of a comfortable life. Now, as she stood in the single dusty street of Pinewood Creek, that promise literally smoldered in the distance. When did it happen? Eleanor asked the shopkeeper, Mr. Holloway, struggling to keep her voice steady. 3 nights ago. He twisted his hat in his hands, clearly uncomfortable. Lightning strike, they say. Took the main house and most of the barn. Thomas was... He hesitated. "Please," Eleanor urged, her knuckles white around the handle of her trunk. "Thomas didn't make it out, miss. I'm sorry to be the one to tell you." The world tilted beneath Eleanor's feet. She'd never met Thomas Sullivan, had known him only through ink and paper, yet the finality of his death struck her with unexpected force. She was alone, nearly penniless, in a town where her only connection lay dead. "Is there a hotel?" she managed to ask. "The Pinewood Inn, just down the street." Mr. Holloway pointed. "Martha Jenkins runs it. She'll take good care of you until you decide what's next." Eleanor nodded, unable to form words of gratitude. She'd traveled over 2,000 miles, sold nearly everything she owned, left her ailing father in her cousin's care, all for a future that had vanished into smoke. Martha Jenkins was a broad-shouldered woman with silver-streaked hair pulled into a severe bun. Her eyes, however, held a warmth that Eleanor desperately needed. "Thomas Sullivan's bride?" Martha asked when Eleanor introduced herself. "Lord have mercy, child. What terrible timing." "Mr. Holloway told me what happened," Eleanor said. "I'd like a room for the night, please. Tomorrow I'll—" She trailed off, having no idea how to finish that sentence. Martha patted her hand. "You'll stay as long as you need. First night's in the house." The room was small but clean, with a narrow bed and a window overlooking the main street. Eleanor sat on the edge of the mattress, still wearing her travel clothes, staring at nothing. The practical part of her mind, the part that had kept her family afloat after her mother's death, began calculating. She had $12.43 to her name, not enough for a return ticket to Boston, not nearly enough. A soft knock at the door roused her. Martha stood there with a tray of stew and fresh bread. "You need to eat," the innkeeper said firmly. "Then sleep. Things have a way of looking different in the morning." But morning brought no solutions. Eleanor washed her face in the ceramic basin, donned her second-best dress, and headed downstairs. The inn's small dining room contained only one other guest, a red-faced cattle buyer who tipped his hat before returning to his eggs and coffee. The harsh Montana winter had finally released its grip on the land, but for Eleanor Winters, the journey west felt colder than any blizzard she'd endured back in Boston. As the stagecoach rattled over the uneven terrain, she clutched the worn photograph of Thomas Sullivan, her soon-to-be husband, and wondered if she'd made the gravest mistake of her life. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Final stop, Pinewood Creek. The driver's voice cut through her thoughts. Eleanor gathered her meager belongings, heart pounding against her ribs. After 3 months of letters, she was about to meet the man who had promised her a life of comfort on his thriving cattle ranch. But as she stepped down onto the dusty road, her eyes widened at the plume of black smoke rising from the direction described in Thomas's letters. A local shopkeeper approached, his face grim. "You must be the mail-order bride," he said, voice heavy with something Eleanor couldn't place. "I'm afraid you've arrived in nothing but ashes, miss." What the shopkeeper couldn't tell her was that someone was watching from the tree line, a figure shrouded in shadow, with eyes the same piercing blue as the man in her photograph. Thomas's brother, Daniel Sullivan, hadn't spoken more than 10 words to anyone in over 5 years. But as he observed the woman his brother had sent for, something stirred within him that he'd long thought dead. Neither Eleanor nor Daniel could have predicted how their lives would intertwine from the ashes of broken promises, or the dangerous secrets that had turned the Sullivan Ranch to cinders in the first place. Montana Territory, 1885. Eleanor Winters had always prided herself on pragmatism. At 26, with no prospects in Boston and her father's mounting medical debts threatening to consume what little they had left, answering Thomas Sullivan's advertisement in the Matrimonial Gazette had seemed the only sensible choice. Established ranchers seeks educated, resilient wife to share in prosperity and build a family in Montana Territory. His letters had been straightforward yet kind, describing lush pastures, a sturdy 2-story home, and the promise of a comfortable life. Now, as she stood in the single dusty street of Pinewood Creek, that promise literally smoldered in the distance. When did it happen? Eleanor asked the shopkeeper, Mr. Holloway, struggling to keep her voice steady. 3 nights ago. He twisted his hat in his hands, clearly uncomfortable. Lightning strike, they say. Took the main house and most of the barn. Thomas was... He hesitated. "Please," Eleanor urged, her knuckles white around the handle of her trunk. "Thomas didn't make it out, miss. I'm sorry to be the one to tell you." The world tilted beneath Eleanor's feet. She'd never met Thomas Sullivan, had known him only through ink and paper, yet the finality of his death struck her with unexpected force. She was alone, nearly penniless, in a town where her only connection lay dead. "Is there a hotel?" she managed to ask. "The Pinewood Inn, just down the street." Mr. Holloway pointed. "Martha Jenkins runs it. She'll take good care of you until you decide what's next." Eleanor nodded, unable to form words of gratitude. She'd traveled over 2,000 miles, sold nearly everything she owned, left her ailing father in her cousin's care, all for a future that had vanished into smoke. Martha Jenkins was a broad-shouldered woman with silver-streaked hair pulled into a severe bun. Her eyes, however, held a warmth that Eleanor desperately needed. "Thomas Sullivan's bride?" Martha asked when Eleanor introduced herself. "Lord have mercy, child. What terrible timing." "Mr. Holloway told me what happened," Eleanor said. "I'd like a room for the night, please. Tomorrow I'll—" She trailed off, having no idea how to finish that sentence. Martha patted her hand. "You'll stay as long as you need. First night's in the house." The room was small but clean, with a narrow bed and a window overlooking the main street. Eleanor sat on the edge of the mattress, still wearing her travel clothes, staring at nothing. The practical part of her mind, the part that had kept her family afloat after her mother's death, began calculating. She had $12.43 to her name, not enough for a return ticket to Boston, not nearly enough. A soft knock at the door roused her. Martha stood there with a tray of stew and fresh bread. "You need to eat," the innkeeper said firmly. "Then sleep. Things have a way of looking different in the morning." But morning brought no solutions. Eleanor washed her face in the ceramic basin, donned her second-best dress, and headed downstairs. The inn's small dining room contained only one other guest, a red-faced cattle buyer who tipped his hat before returning to his eggs and coffee. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Eleanor sensed she would get nothing more from him on the subject. She turned back to survey the ranch once more, trying to imagine the life that might have been. Something caught her eye, a movement at the tree line, so brief she thought she might have imagined it. "Is someone there?" she asked. Sheriff Dawson followed her gaze but shook his head. "Probably just a deer. Come on, we should head back before it gets late." As they mounted their horses, Eleanor couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. She glanced back at the tree line, but saw nothing except shadows among the pines. The ride back to town was quiet, each lost in their own thoughts. As they approached Pinewood Creek, Sheriff Dawson broke the silence. "I know it's not my place, but you seem like a sensible woman. If I were you, I'd take that teaching position, start fresh, and just abandon any claim to—" Eleanor hesitated. "I'm not sure what claim I even have. Legally speaking, not much. You weren't yet married." The sheriff's tone was gentle but firm. "And Pinewood Creek isn't the kind of place where a single woman can run a ranch alone. Folks would talk." Eleanor bristled at this, but she knew he was right. The conventions of society followed even into the frontier. Still, something about simply walking away from the Sullivan Ranch felt wrong, almost like a betrayal of the future she'd committed to. At the inn, Martha had prepared a hot bath for her, seeming to sense Eleanor's need for solitude and comfort. Later, wrapped in her dressing gown, Eleanor sat by the window watching the town settle into evening. Lamps flickered on in windows, and the saloon down the street grew rowdier as cowboys and miners sought entertainment after a day's work. A knock at her door revealed Martha with a steaming cup of tea. "Chamomile," the innkeeper said, "helps with sleep." "Thank you." Eleanor accepted the cup gratefully. "Martha, may I ask you something about Daniel Sullivan?" Martha's expression grew guarded. "What did you hear?" "Almost nothing. The sheriff mentioned someone named Rebecca Fletcher but wouldn't elaborate." Martha sighed heavily and closed the door behind her. "It's not a pretty story." "Few true stories are," Eleanor replied. "The Sullivan brothers were inseparable as boys," Martha began, settling into the room's only chair. "Their parents died of influenza when they were young. Thomas 16, Daniel 14. They worked neighboring ranches until they saved enough to buy their own place." She paused, sipping from her own teacup. "Then the war came. Thomas stayed to run the ranch, had a clubfoot that kept him from service. Daniel enlisted, fought with the Union at Antietam, Fredericksburg, Gettysburg, came back in '65 with medals and nightmares." Eleanor nodded. She'd seen such men in Boston, hollow-eyed veterans jumping at sudden noises, drinking to forget what they'd witnessed. For a while he seemed to improve, Martha continued. Started courting Rebecca Fletcher, daughter of the mercantile owner. Pretty girl, sweet disposition. They were to be married that spring. Her voice softened. Then came the incident. What happened? Eleanor asked when Martha fell silent. Daniel had one of his episodes, the war memories. It happened at the Founders' Day dance. He thought he heard cannon fire when it was just boys with firecrackers. Pulled a knife, nearly stabbed Will Harris before they subdued him. Eleanor's hand flew to her throat. Was anyone hurt? No, thank the Lord. But Rebecca's father forbade the marriage after that, called Daniel dangerous, unstable. Rebecca, bless her heart, defied her father, snuck out to meet Daniel that night. Martha's eyes grew distant with the memory. Nobody knows exactly what happened. Daniel claims she fell from her horse, hit her head on a rock. By the time he got her to the doctor, she was gone. How awful, Eleanor whispered. Some folks had their doubts. Rebecca was an excellent rider, and there had been whispers about Daniel's temper. Nothing was ever proven, but suspicion is a powerful thing in a small town. Martha stood, collecting Eleanor's empty cup. After the funeral, Daniel retreated to that cabin on the ridge. Thomas tried to defend him, but eventually even he stopped making excuses. The story settled heavily in the room, a tragedy from years past that still cast its shadow. Thank you for telling. Me, Eleanor said finally. Martha nodded. Get some rest now. Tomorrow's soon enough to decide your path. But sleep proved elusive. Eleanor's mind raced with all she'd learned. About Thomas, about Daniel, about the tragic history of the Sullivan brothers. Outside her window the moon rose, casting silver light across the sleeping town. She rose and dressed quietly, drawn by some inexplicable need to walk in the night air. The town was mostly silent now, even the saloon having gone quiet. Eleanor wrapped her shawl tightly around her shoulders and stepped onto the boardwalk. Pinewood Creek looked different in the moonlight, softer somehow, its rough edges blurred by shadow. Eleanor walked slowly, her footsteps quiet on the wooden planks. At the end of the street, she paused and looked westward, toward the ranch she'd never know and the life she'd never live. A movement caught her eye, a rider on the road leading. Into town. Eleanor stepped back into the shadow of a building, watching curiously. The figure dismounted outside the mercantile, tying the horse to a hitching post. In the moonlight, she could make out a man's tall frame and broad shoulders, his face obscured by the brim of his hat. He moved with deliberate caution, glancing around as if to ensure he wasn't observed. From a saddlebag, he withdrew something and approached the mercantile's door. Eleanor watched, puzzled, as he left whatever it was on the doorstep, then quickly remounted and rode away. Curiosity overcoming caution, Eleanor approached the mercantile once the rider had disappeared. On the doorstep lay a small cloth bundle. She knelt and carefully unwrapped it to reveal a stack of bills and a folded note. In the moonlight, she could just make out the words, "For supplies, leave at the Fallen Oak." Eleanor rewrapped the bundle and returned it to the doorstep. She hurried back to the inn, her mind alight with questions. Who was the mysterious rider? Was it Daniel Sullivan emerging from isolation to conduct business in the dead of night? Back in her room, Eleanor sat by the window watching the road. Out of town. The rider had already disappeared from view, likely heading back to the mountains. She thought of the two Sullivan brothers, one dead before she could meet him, the other a recluse with a tragic past. Neither was the future she had imagined when she boarded that train in Boston. Yet something about this place, these people, and the unfinished story of the Sullivan Ranch called to her. Sheriff Dawson's advice to take the teaching position and start fresh made practical sense, but Eleanor Winters had not traveled 2,000 miles to settle for the practical path. As dawn broke over Pinewood Creek, Eleanor made her decision. She would visit the burned ranch once more, alone this time. And if Daniel Sullivan was indeed watching from the shadows, she intended to meet the man who might be her only connection to the future she had journeyed so far to find. Dawn painted the eastern sky in watercolor hues as Eleanor saddled Daisy, the mare Sheriff Dawson had loaned her the previous day. Martha had protested when Eleanor announced her intention to ride out to the ranch alone. "It's not proper," the innkeeper had insisted, "and it could be dangerous." "I'll be back before sundown," Eleanor promised, accepting the small package of bread and cheese Martha pressed into her hands. Now, as she guided Daisy along the familiar path west of town, Eleanor questioned her own judgment. What exactly did she hope to accomplish? The rational part of her mind, the part that had kept her family solvent through her father's illness, urged her to return to town, accept the teaching position, and build a respectable life in Pinewood Creek. But something stronger pulled her toward the Sullivan Ranch. Perhaps it was simply the need for closure, to fully understand what might have been before letting it go. Or perhaps, she admitted to herself, it was curiosity about the mysterious Daniel Sullivan. The morning air carried the scent of pine and sage as Eleanor crested the same hill she'd climbed with Sheriff Dawson. The valley stretched before her, somehow even more beautiful in the morning light. She paused, allowing Daisy to graze while she took in the vista that might have been her home. The charred remains of the main house looked less ominous in daylight, though no less final. Eleanor dismounted near what remained of the front porch, tying Daisy to a post that had survived the blaze. She walked the perimeter slowly, trying to imagine the home Thomas had described in his letters. 2 stories, 4 bedrooms, a study with bookshelves he'd built himself. "He was going to add a sunroom for you." The deep voice startled Eleanor so badly she nearly fell. She whirled to find a man standing 20 feet away, partially shadowed by the burned chimney. He wore a worn leather jacket over a faded blue shirt, dark trousers tucked into scuffed boots. His face, half hidden by several days' growth of beard, he bore a striking resemblance to the photograph of Thomas she carried, the same strong jaw, the same high cheekbones. But where Thomas's eyes had been warm in his photograph, this man's gaze was wary, almost feral. "Daniel Sullivan?" Eleanor managed to ask, her heart hammering against her ribs. He gave a curt nod, making no move to approach closer. "You're Thomas's bride, Eleanor Winters," she confirmed, forcing herself to stand taller. "I arrived the day before yesterday." "I know." His voice was rough, as if unused to conversation. "I saw you with Dawson," so she hadn't imagined being watched. "Why didn't you make yourself known then?" Daniel's mouth tightened. "Didn't see the point. You'll be heading back east now that Thomas is gone." There was no accusation in his tone, just a statement of what he considered fact. Eleanor found herself unexpectedly irritated by his presumption. "Actually, I haven't decided what I'll do," she said, "and I would appreciate not having my decisions made for me by strangers." Something flashed in Daniel's eyes. Surprise, perhaps. He studied her for a long moment before speaking again. "You're not what I expected. I could say the same of you, Mr. Sullivan." Eleanor gestured to the ruins. "I came to see what remains of my intended future. Since you're here, perhaps you could tell me what happened the night of the fire." Daniel's face darkened. "I was up at my cabin. By the time I saw the flames, it was too late." He turned away, staring at the charred timbers. Thomas was a sound sleeper. Probably never woke. The grief in his voice was unexpected. Martha and Sheriff Dawson had given Eleanor the impression that the brothers were estranged. "I'm sorry for your loss," she said softly. Daniel's head jerked up, his eyes narrowing, as if suspicious of her sympathy. "Thomas wrote that you were a lawyer's daughter," he said, abruptly changing the subject. "Yes. My father practiced law in Boston until his illness. Then you understand property rights. This land was Thomas's, now it's mine." The bluntness stung, though Eleanor wasn't sure why. She had no legal claim to the Sullivan Ranch, as Sheriff Dawson had pointed out. Still, after months of correspondence and the long journey west, to be so summarily dismissed felt like salt in an open wound. "I'm well aware of inheritance law, Mr. Sullivan," she replied stiffly. "I have no intention of contesting your right to your brother's property." Daniel seemed to register her hurt, his expression softening fractionally. "I didn't mean—" He broke off, running a hand through his dark hair in frustration. "I'm not good with words, not like Thomas." The mention of Thomas hung between them, a shared connection neither had anticipated. "What will you do with the ranch?" Eleanor asked, genuinely curious. Daniel looked across the valley, his gaze distant. "Rebuild, I suppose. Can't let it go now." "You'll come down from your cabin? Live here?" His mouth twisted in what might have been a grimace or a smile. "People in town won't like that." "Because of Rebecca Fletcher," Eleanor said, without thinking. Daniel's face went completely still, his eyes locking onto hers with an intensity that made her step back involuntarily. "What do you know about Rebecca?" "Only what Martha Jenkins told me," Eleanor admitted, "that there was an accident, that you were blamed, though nothing was proven." "Blamed," Daniel repeated, his voice hollow. "Is that what they call it? I didn't just lose Rebecca that night. I lost everything, my future, my good name, even my brother in the end." The raw pain in his words silenced any response Eleanor might have offered. Daniel turned away, his shoulders tense beneath his jacket. "You should go back to town, Miss Winters. There's nothing for you here but ash and bad memories." Eleanor knew he was right. The sensible course, the safe course, was to return to Pinewood Creek, accept the teaching position, and forget about the Sullivan Ranch and its troubled owner. Yet something held her in place. Some instinct that there was more to the story of the Sullivan brothers than anyone in town had told her. "What if I helped you rebuild?" The words left her mouth before she'd fully formed the thought. Daniel turned back, genuine shock written across his features. "What?" Eleanor was as surprised as he was, but as she considered the idea, it began to take shape. "The ranch was to be my home, too. Thomas and I had an agreement. I would help manage the household, assist with accounts, maybe start a kitchen garden." She gestured to the burned house. "Those plans needn't die with him." "You can't be serious." Daniel's tone was flat with disbelief. "A Boston lawyer's daughter working alongside a man the whole town thinks is a murderer?" "I don't know what you are, Mr. Sullivan," Eleanor replied. "But I do know that I traveled 2,000 miles to start a new life, and I'm not ready to abandon that dream because circumstances have changed." Daniel stared at her as if she'd started speaking in tongues. "You don't even know me." "I didn't know Thomas either, not really." Eleanor smoothed her skirts, a nervous gesture she'd inherited from her mother. "We made our arrangement based on mutual benefit and respect. I'm proposing something similar." "And what exactly would this arrangement entail?" Daniel asked, wariness evident in every line of his body. "I would stay in town at the inn for now. Each day I would ride out here to help with the rebuilding, sewing, curtains, ordering furniture, keeping accounts. In exchange, you would provide me with a small wage and a cabin of my own on the property once it's built." Eleanor straightened her shoulders. "A business partnership, nothing more." Daniel shook his head in apparent amazement. "You're either the bravest woman I've ever met or the most foolish." "Perhaps a bit of both," Eleanor conceded with a small smile. "Do we have an agreement?" Instead of answering directly, Daniel walked toward the barn, gesturing for her to follow. Inside, the air smelled of hay and horses. Sunlight filtered through gaps in the roof where the fire had damaged part of the structure. Daniel stopped before a wooden chest pushed against the far wall. "Thomas kept some of your letters in here," he said, kneeling to open the lid. "He read parts of them to me when he'd ride up to bring supplies." He withdrew several folded papers, handling them with unexpected gentleness. He said you had a practical mind and a kind heart, said you'd make the ranch feel like a proper home. Eleanor's throat tightened at this glimpse of the man she'd never know. Did you approve of his sending for a bride? Daniel's expression shuttered. Wasn't my place to approve or disapprove. Thomas did what he thought best. He closed the chest and stood. He was excited about your coming, worked himself to exhaustion getting everything ready. A sadness deeper than grief crossed his features. The night before the fire, he rode up to my cabin, wanted me to come down for dinner when you arrived, to be part of things again. Daniel's gaze dropped to the barn floor. We argued. I said things I can't take back now. The admission hung in the air between them, heavy with regret. Eleanor understood suddenly that Daniel's grief was complicated by guilt, the unresolved conflict of that final meeting. I would still like to help rebuild, she said softly, if not for the future Thomas and I planned, then to honor his memory. Daniel studied her for a long moment, his blue eyes searching her face as if looking for deception or ulterior motives. Finally, he gave a single, curt nod. 1 month, he said. We'll try your arrangement for 1 month. After that, we'll decide whether to continue. Relief flooded through Eleanor, though she wasn't entirely sure why it mattered so much. Thank you, Mr. Sullivan. Daniel, he corrected, uncomfortable with the formality. If we're to work together, you should call me Daniel. Daniel, she repeated, extending her hand as she would in a business transaction in Boston. He hesitated before taking it, his calloused palm rough against her skin. The handshake was brief but binding, a contract between strangers united by loss and an uncertain future. We should start by surveying what can be salvaged, Eleanor said, slipping naturally into the practical mindset that had served her well, in her father's office, and make a list of what supplies we'll need from town. A ghost of a smile touched Daniel's lips. Thomas was right about you. Before Eleanor could respond, the sound of approaching horses reached them. Daniel tensed immediately, his hand moving to his belt, where she noticed for the first time he carried a holstered revolver. Stay here, he ordered, moving to the barn door. Eleanor followed despite his instruction, peering around him to see Sheriff Dawson approaching with 2 other men. The sheriff's expression darkened when he spotted Daniel. Well now, Dawson called, as they drew nearer. Daniel Sullivan, twice in town in 1 week. Must be some kind of record. I haven't been to town, Daniel replied, his voice cold. Someone left payment at Fletcher's Mercantile last night. Old man Fletcher says it was you. Eleanor felt Daniel stiffen beside her. The mysterious nighttime rider. She'd been right. What of it? I pay my debts. The sheriff dismounted, his gaze shifting to Eleanor with undisguised surprise. Ms. Winters, what are you doing out here alone with Sullivan? Before she could answer, Daniel stepped slightly in front of her. Ms. Winters came to see the property. I happened to be here. The protective gesture wasn't lost on Eleanor or the sheriff, whose eyes narrowed suspiciously. Is that right, Ms. Winters? Dawson asked. Eleanor moved to stand beside Daniel rather than behind him. Yes, Sheriff. In fact, Mr. Sullivan and I were just discussing plans to rebuild the ranch. Rebuild? The sheriff looked between them in confusion. Together? I've hired Ms. Winters to assist with the reconstruction, Daniel said smoothly. She'll be managing the accounts and household aspects while I handle the physical labor. The 2 riders with the sheriff exchanged skeptical glances. One, a red-headed man with a drooping mustache, spat on the ground. Town won't stand for it, Sullivan. Woman like her shacking up with the likes of you. Watch your mouth, Harris, Daniel growled, his hand returning to his holster. Mr. Sullivan has offered me a professional position. Nothing more, Eleanor interjected firmly. And I've accepted. My personal decisions are not subject to town approval. Sheriff Dawson removed his hat, turning it in his hands as if considering his next words carefully. "Miss Winters, I respect your right to make your own choices, but you don't know the history here." "I know enough," she replied. "I know Mr. Sullivan has not been convicted of any crime. I know this ranch rightfully belongs to him. And I know that I came west for a new beginning, which is exactly what I intend to have." The sheriff sighed heavily. "Will Harris lost his brother in the war," he said quietly. "He and some others in town still hold a grudge against Daniel for making it back when good men didn't. Add that to the business with Rebecca." "Ancient history," Daniel cut in. "I've kept to myself for 5 years, Sheriff. I'll continue to do so, except for necessary business." "Like rebuilding the main house," Dawson observed. "It was Thomas's dream," Daniel said simply. "I won't let it die with him." Something in his tone must have reached the sheriff, who nodded slowly. "Fair enough, but I'm warning you both. There'll be talk, and some folks won't stop at talk." "We understand the risk," Eleanor said, surprised to find she meant it. In the space of an hour, she had committed herself to a path that would likely make her an outcast in Pinewood Creek before she'd even truly arrived. The men left shortly after, the sheriff tipping his hat to Eleanor, while the others simply stared. When they were out of earshot, Eleanor released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "Still certain about this arrangement?" Daniel asked, his expression unreadable. Eleanor smoothed her skirts, buying time to collect her thoughts. The rational part of her mind screamed that she was making a terrible mistake, aligning herself with a man the town feared, isolating herself from potential allies, possibly jeopardizing her reputation beyond repair. Yet some deeper instinct told her this was right. "I made my decision," she said finally. "I stand by it." Daniel studied her face, then nodded once. "I'll draw up plans for the new house. We can review them tomorrow." "I'll bring ledgers for the accounts," Eleanor offered. "And perhaps catalogues for furnishings." The conversation felt surreal, mundane plans laid over extraordinary circumstances, yet it grounded Eleanor, gave her purpose amid the uncertainty. She mounted Daisy for the ride back to town, aware that her life had irrevocably changed course in ways she couldn't yet comprehend. "One more thing," Daniel called as she prepared to depart. "The townspeople will try to turn you against me. They'll tell you I'm dangerous." "Are you?" Eleanor asked candidly. His eyes met hers, startlingly blue against his weathered face. "Not to you." It wasn't exactly a denial, but Eleanor found herself believing him nonetheless. She nodded a farewell and turned Daisy toward town, feeling Daniel's gaze on her back long after the Sullivan Ranch had faded from view. The ride gave Eleanor time to reflect on the impulsive decision she'd made. By the time Pinewood Creek came into sight, doubts had begun to creep in. Martha would be horrified. Sheriff Dawson clearly disapproved. She would be aligning herself with a man the town had effectively exiled, a man suspected of involvement in a young woman's death, however unproven those suspicions might be. Yet underneath the doubt lay a current of something else, a sense of rightness she couldn't explain. Perhaps it was simply that she'd traveled too far and sacrificed too much to turn back now. Or perhaps she recognized in Daniel Sullivan a kindred spirit, someone who, like her, had lost more than most could understand. Martha was waiting on the inn's porch, arms crossed, expression thunderous. "Half the town's talking about you riding out to Sullivan Place alone," she said, as Eleanor dismounted, "and the other half's talking about you throwing in your lot with Daniel Sullivan." "News travels fast," Eleanor observed dryly. "It's a small town." Martha ushered her inside, away from curious eyes. In the privacy of the inn's parlor, she rounded on Eleanor. "Have you lost your mind, girl? Daniel Sullivan is trouble with a capital T." "He's a man who's lost his brother," Eleanor countered. "And I'm a woman who's lost her intended husband. We've made a business arrangement that benefits us both." Martha's expression softened slightly. You've got a good heart, Eleanor, but good hearts get broken in these parts just as easily as anywhere else. I'm not looking for romance, Martha. Just a purpose, a future. The innkeeper sighed heavily. Well, you've certainly made your bed. Just be sure you're prepared for what's coming. Not everyone in town will be as understanding as the sheriff. As if to prove her point, dinner that evening was a tense affair. The other guests at the inn, the cattle buyer and an elderly couple passing through to Oregon, kept shooting curious glances at Eleanor. When she entered the general store the following morning to purchase ledgers and paper, conversation died instantly. Mrs. Fletcher, a pinch-faced woman with steel-grey hair pulled severely back, served her in frigid silence. Only the young clerk at the post office showed any warmth, smiling shyly as she mailed a letter to her father in Boston, explaining her decision to stay in Montana. "Pay them no mind," he said, when an older woman pointedly moved away from the counter where Eleanor stood. "Folks here are slow to welcome newcomers in general. They'll come around." Eleanor wasn't so certain, but she thanked him for his kindness. As she left the post office, she nearly collided with a young woman carrying a basket of fresh bread. "Oh, I'm sorry," Eleanor apologized. The woman, perhaps 19 or 20 with auburn hair escaping from beneath her bonnet, studied Eleanor curiously. "You're Thomas Sullivan's mail-order bride," she stated. "I'm Sarah Jenkins, Martha's daughter." Eleanor Winters. She extended her hand, expecting another cold reception. To her surprise, Sarah shook it warmly. "I've been helping Mama at the inn for the past week. Usually I teach at the schoolhouse, but school's out for planting season." "The sheriff mentioned the teaching position," Eleanor said. Sarah's eyes lit up. "Are you interested? The children would benefit greatly from someone with your education." "I've actually accepted a position elsewhere," Eleanor admitted. "With Daniel Sullivan." She waited for the young woman's expression to cool, but Sarah merely nodded thoughtfully. "Mama told me. Bold choice. You don't disapprove?" Sarah glanced around before lowering her voice. "Rebecca Fletcher was my friend. What happened to her was a tragedy, but—" She hesitated. "Daniel Sullivan isn't the monster some make him out to be." Before Eleanor could press for details, the mercantile door opened and Mrs. Fletcher herself emerged, her sharp gaze landing on them immediately. "We'll talk more later," Sarah whispered, then raised her voice. "Do visit the schoolhouse someday, Ms. Winters. The children would enjoy meeting a lady from Boston." As Sarah moved away, Eleanor felt a glimmer of hope. Perhaps not everyone in Pinewood Creek was determined to ostracize her. She continued her errands, purchasing the supplies she'd need to begin work at the ranch the following day. By the time she returned to the inn, Eleanor felt drained from the constant stares and whispers. She retreated to her room with the new ledger books, determined to prepare properly for her first official day as Daniel Sullivan's business partner. Outside her window, the sun began its descent behind the western mountains, casting long shadows. Across Pinewood Creek, somewhere in those mountains, Daniel Sullivan was likely preparing for another solitary night in his cabin. Tomorrow, they would begin the work of rebuilding from ashes, the house, the ranch, and perhaps something of themselves as well. Eleanor opened a fresh ledger, dipped her pen in ink, and wrote on the first page, "Sullivan Ranch Accounts, April, 1885. A new beginning, indeed. The following weeks established a routine that Eleanor found oddly comforting. Each morning, she rode Daisy out to the Sullivan Ranch, ledgers and plans tucked securely in her saddlebag. Most days, she found Daniel already at work, clearing debris, salvaging what could be saved, measuring and marking for the new foundation. He rarely greeted her with more than a nod, but Eleanor had come to understand this wasn't rudeness. Daniel Sullivan simply used words sparingly, as if he'd been allotted only so many in his lifetime and needed to conserve them. Today marked 3 weeks since their unusual partnership began. Eleanor dismounted near the temporary shelter Daniel had constructed. Beside the barn, a simple lean-to with a table and chairs where they could review plans and take meals. "You're late," Daniel observed, glancing up from the blueprints spread across the rough-hewn table. "I had a visitor this morning," Eleanor replied, removing her gloves. "Sarah Jenkins came by the inn with a proposition." Daniel's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. In their weeks of working together, Eleanor had learned to read these subtle shifts in his demeanor, the slight narrowing of his eyes that indicated wariness, the barely there lift at the corner of his mouth that served as his version of a smile. "What? A kind of proposition?" he asked, turning his attention back to the blueprints. "She's organizing a spring social at the schoolhouse. Wants me to help with the preparations." Eleanor poured herself a cup of coffee from the pot, warming on the small stove. "I told her I'd consider it." Daniel's pencil stilled on the paper. "You should go." The response surprised her. "You think so?" "No reason for you to be as isolated as I am." His tone was matter-of-fact, devoid of self-pity. "Sarah Jenkins is well-liked. Her friendship could make things easier for you in town." Eleanor studied him over the rim of her cup. In the 3 weeks they'd worked together, Daniel had proven himself to be observant, intelligent, and unexpectedly considerate in small ways, keeping the coffee hot for her arrival, constructing a mounting block by the hitching post when he noticed her struggle to dismount Daisy in her long skirts. "What about you?" she asked. "Will you attend the social?" A sound escaped him that might have been a laugh, though it held little humor. "I haven't attended a town gathering in 5 years. Eleanor, I don't intend to start now." Eleanor let the subject drop, moving instead to business. "The lumber shipment should arrive tomorrow. Mr. Calloway says his men can begin on the foundation by week's end." Daniel nodded, making a notation on the blueprint. "We'll need to decide on the final layout today." They bent over the plans together, shoulders nearly touching, as they discussed room configurations and window placements. The house Daniel proposed was similar to the one Thomas had described in his letters, though with some notable differences. Thomas had planned ornate wooden trim and a wraparound porch with decorative railings. Daniel's design was simpler, more functional, with clean lines and sturdy construction. "What about a study?" Eleanor asked, noticing its absence in the current plan. "Don't need one. Thomas mentioned bookshelves," she persisted. "He wrote that he was collecting volumes for a proper library." Daniel's jaw tightened. "Those books are burned with everything else." "We could start a new collection," Eleanor suggested. "I've already ordered several books from the catalogue, a medical reference, some volumes on animal husbandry, and a few classics." Daniel looked at her sharply. "You're spending your wages on books for the ranch?" Eleanor felt a flush creep up her neck. It seemed practical. A ranch this size should have reference materials. For a moment Daniel simply stared at her, something unreadable flickering in his eyes. Then he turned back to the blueprints, made a few swift adjustments, and pointed to a space off the main living area. "Study goes here," he said quietly, "south-facing for the light." Eleanor smiled, recognizing the gesture for what it was, not just an accommodation, but a small victory in her ongoing effort to make this rebuilding about more than just replacing what was lost. They worked through the morning, breaking only. When Eleanor insisted they eat the lunch Martha had packed for her, thick sandwiches, apple slices, and oatmeal cookies still warm from the oven. "Martha's warming to you," Daniel observed, accepting the food with a nod of thanks. Grudgingly, Eleanor agreed. "She still thinks I'm making a terrible mistake, but she stopped trying to talk me out of it." "Smart woman," Daniel murmured after lunch. They walked the perimeter of the burned house, Daniel marking the corners for the new foundation with wooden stakes. Eleanor found herself trying to envision the completed structure. Solid walls rising from the ashes, windows catching, the afternoon light, smoke curling from the chimney on cold Montana evenings. "Will you live here?" she asked suddenly. "When it's finished?" Daniel hammered a stake into the hard ground before answering. That was the plan. "And your cabin on the ridge?" He straightened, wiping sweat from his brow with his shirt sleeve. "I'll keep it. Sometimes a man needs solitude." Eleanor nodded, understanding the sentiment all too well. She'd grown accustomed to her own company during her father's long illness, finding comfort in quiet moments with only her thoughts for company. "The carpenter can start on your cabin next week," Daniel added, moving to the next corner. "Just a simple structure to begin with, one room with a stove, table, bed. We can add to it later if needed." The mention of her own space on the ranch sent an unexpected thrill through Eleanor. Although Martha had been generous about extending her stay at the inn, Eleanor longed for a place to truly call her own, a space where she could arrange her few belongings and perhaps, finally, begin to feel settled in this wild, beautiful country. "Thank you," she said simply. Daniel merely nodded, but she caught that slight lift at the corner of his mouth that she'd come to recognize as his version of a smile. They worked until late afternoon, when dark clouds began gathering over the western mountains, promising an evening storm. Eleanor was securing the blueprints in her saddlebag when the sound of approaching horses drew their attention. "Expecting visitors?" she asked, noting the immediate tension in Daniel's posture. "No." His hand moved to the revolver at his hip, a gesture Eleanor had observed whenever unexpected situations arose. 3 riders approached, one she recognized as Will Harris, the redhead who had accompanied Sheriff Dawson on their previous visit. The other 2 were strangers to her, rough-looking men with the dust of the trail still clinging to their clothes. "Sullivan!" Harris called as they drew near. "Got some visitors interested in your cattle." Daniel stepped forward, positioning himself slightly in front of Eleanor. "My cattle aren't for sale, Harris." The largest of the 3 men, a beefy individual with a pockmarked face and small, calculating eyes, spat a stream of tobacco juice onto the ground. "Heard different in town. Heard Sullivan Ranch was up for grabs since Thomas died." "You heard wrong," Daniel replied, his voice deceptively calm. Eleanor moved to stand beside him, unwilling to cower behind his protection. "As you can see, gentlemen, we're in the process of rebuilding. The Sullivan Ranch continues to operate." The 3 men exchanged glances, clearly surprised by her presence and intervention. This the mail-order bride? The pockmarked man asked Harris, his gaze traveling over Eleanor in a way that made her skin crawl. "Yep," Harris confirmed, "throwing in her lot with the wrong Sullivan brother, if you ask me." "I don't recall anyone asking you, Mr. Harris," Eleanor replied coldly. The 3rd rider, younger than the others, with a faded red bandana around his neck, snickered at her retort, earning a glare from his companions. "Just passing along an offer, Sullivan," the pockmarked man said, returning his attention to Daniel. $500 for the whole spread. Considering the circumstances, it's more than fair." Daniel's expression didn't change, but Eleanor felt him coil beside her like a spring compressed to its limit. "The ranch isn't for sale, not at any price." The pockmarked man's jovial demeanor slipped, revealing something harder beneath. "You might want to reconsider. Man in your position can't afford to be choosy." "My position?" Daniel's voice remained steady, but Eleanor heard the dangerous undercurrent. "Killer with no friends in town," Harris interjected. "Ranch half-burned, brother dead. How long before folks start wondering if the fire was really an accident?" The accusation hung in the air like gunpowder smoke. Eleanor felt the blood drain from her face, her mind racing to process the implication. Beside her, Daniel had gone completely still. "You should leave," he said quietly. "Now." Harris smirked, clearly pleased to have struck a nerve. "Think about the offer, Sullivan. Jennings here doesn't like to be turned down." He jerked his head toward the pockmarked man. "Especially by murdering trash." Daniel moved so quickly, Eleanor barely registered it. One moment he was beside her, the next he had Harris by the shirt collar, the smaller man's feet dangling inches above the ground. "Say it again," Daniel growled, his face inches from Harris's suddenly pale countenance. The pockmarked man, Jennings, reached for his holster, but froze when Eleanor drew the small derringer she kept in her skirt pocket, aiming it steadily at his chest. "That would be unwise, Mr. Jennings," she said, surprising herself with how calm she sounded. For a tense moment, no one moved. Then Daniel released Harris, shoving him back toward his horse. "Get off my land," he ordered, his voice cold as Montana. "Winter. All of you." The young rider with the bandana was already backing his horse away, clearly wanting no part of the confrontation. Jennings hesitated, his small eyes darting between Daniel's rigid stance and Eleanor's unwavering derringer. "Cattle markets declining anyway," he muttered, trying to save face as he turned his horse. "Land's probably not worth the asking price." They rode away, Harris casting one venomous glance over his shoulder before they disappeared over the ridge. Only, when they were out of sight, did Eleanor lower the derringer, her hand trembling slightly now that the danger had passed. She turned to find Daniel staring at her, his expression caught between astonishment and something else she couldn't quite identify. "Where did you learn to handle a gun like that?" he asked. Eleanor tucked the derringer back into her pocket. "My father believed women should be able to protect themselves. He taught me to shoot when I was 16. She smoothed her skirts, a nervous habit. "I've never actually aimed it at a person before today." Daniel's expression softened fractionally. "You've got nerve, Eleanor Winters. I'll give you that." Coming from Daniel Sullivan, she understood this was high praise indeed. "Do you think they'll come back?" she asked, glancing in the direction the men had disappeared. "Eventually." Daniel removed his hat, running a hand through his dark hair. "Men like Jennings don't give up easily when they want something." What did Harris mean? About people questioning whether the fire was really an accident? Daniel replaced his hat, his expression closing like a door slammed shut. "Nothing. Just trying to get under my skin." But Eleanor wasn't convinced. "Daniel, if there's something I should know—" "There's a storm coming," he interrupted, glancing at the darkening sky. "You should head back to town before it hits." The abrupt dismissal stung, but Eleanor recognized the stubborn set of his jaw. Whatever thoughts were troubling him, he wasn't ready to share them. She nodded, gathering her things and mounting Daisy for the ride back to town. "Be careful," Daniel warned as she prepared to depart. "Men like that have loose tongues. By nightfall, half the town will know you pulled a gun on Jennings." "Let them know," Eleanor replied, with more confidence than she felt. "Perhaps they'll think twice before underestimating either of us." The ghost of a smile touched Daniel's lips. "Tomorrow," he said simply. "Tomorrow," she agreed, turning Daisy toward town. The storm caught her halfway back, fat raindrops soaking through her riding cloak despite her efforts to outpace the weather. By the time Eleanor reached the inn, she was thoroughly drenched, her hair plastered to her face and neck. Martha took one look at her bedraggled appearance and ushered her inside, clucking like a mother hen. "Caught in the cloudburst, poor thing. Sarah, fetch some towels and stoke the fire in Miss Winter's room." Sarah appeared, her kind face concerned as she helped Eleanor remove her sodden cloak. "You're shivering. Come upstairs, I'll help you dry clothes." In the privacy of her room, with Sarah's assistance, Eleanor changed into a clean dress, wrapping a woolen shawl around her shoulders for additional warmth. The young woman brushed out her damp hair, chatting amiably about preparations for the spring social. "You really should help with the decorations," Sarah said, gently working through a tangle. "Your Boston sensibilities would elevate the whole affair." Eleanor smiled at the younger woman's enthusiasm. "I'd be happy to help, though I should warn you, my presence might discourage others from attending." Sarah's brush paused mid-stroke. Because of your association with Daniel Sullivan. It wasn't a question, but Eleanor nodded anyway. Your mother says most of the town disapproves. Most isn't all, Sarah replied, resuming her brushing. Rebecca would have wanted someone to stand by him. The mention of Rebecca Fletcher piqued Eleanor's curiosity. You were friends with her. Since childhood. We shared everything. Sarah's voice softened with memory. Rebecca was the kindest person I've ever known. She saw beauty in everything, even in Daniel when he returned from the war, haunted and changed. What happened that night? Eleanor asked quietly. The night she died? Sarah's hands stilled again. No one knows for certain except Daniel. Rebecca snuck out to meet him after her father forbade their courtship. They rode up toward the ridge where his cabin is now. Her voice dropped to nearly a whisper. She never came home. Daniel says she fell from her horse. That's what he told Sheriff Dawson. Sarah set the brush down, moving to sit across from Eleanor. What few people know is that Rebecca suffered from dizzy spells since childhood. Her father kept it quiet, afraid. No respectable man would marry her if they knew. Eleanor frowned. These spells, could they have caused her to fall? That's what I've always believed. Sarah's eyes grew bright with unshed tears, but Mr. Fletcher needed someone to blame. The town was already wary of Daniel after his episode at the Founders' Day dance. It was easy to paint him as dangerous, unstable. Why hasn't anyone spoken up for him in all these years? Fear, mostly. The Fletchers are powerful in Pinewood Creek, and people prefer simple explanations. The disturbed war veteran, the tragic accident. It's neater than questioning. A respected family's version of events. The insight gave Eleanor much to consider. She'd suspected there was more to the story of Rebecca Fletcher's death than town gossip suggested, but Sarah's revelation added a new layer of complexity and injustice to Daniel's situation. Thank you for telling me this, she said sincerely. Sarah squeezed her hand. Rebecca would have liked you, I think. She valued courage above all else. After Sarah left, Eleanor sat by the window, watching rain streak the glass as lightning illuminated the darkened town in brief, brilliant flashes. Her mind turned to Daniel, likely alone in his cabin on the ridge or sheltering in the barn at the ranch. For the first time, she fully comprehended the isolation he'd endured these past 5 years. Not just physical distance from the town, but the weight of suspicion and blame for a tragedy he might have been powerless to prevent. Her thoughts were interrupted by a commotion downstairs, raised voices, the heavy tread of boots on wooden floors. Eleanor opened her door, slipping into the hallway to better hear the conversation below. And then she pulled a gun on Jennings. Cool as you please. Will Harris's distinctive voice carried up the stairs, standing right beside Sullivan, like they were partners in more ways than one, if you take my meaning. Watch your tongue in my establishment, Harris, Martha's stern voice replied. Ms. Winters is a lady. Lady? Consorting with a killer and threatening an honest businessman at gunpoint. Eleanor had heard enough. She descended the stairs, composing her features into a mask of calm dignity, despite the anger simmering beneath. The main room fell silent. At her appearance, all eyes turning to her as she reached the bottom step. Will Harris stood near the door with the young rider who had accompanied him to the ranch earlier. Neither Jennings nor the other patrons of the inn were present. Small mercies, Eleanor supposed. Mr. Harris, she acknowledged coolly. I see. You've been recounting our meeting this afternoon. I hope you've been accurate in your description of events. Harris had the grace to look momentarily abashed before recovering his bluster. Just telling folks how Sullivan nearly strangled me for making him a fair business offer. A fair offer. Eleanor arched an eyebrow. Attempting to swindle a grieving man out of his property and livestock for a fraction of their worth hardly constitutes fair business. The young rider with the bandana shifted uncomfortably. Miss, we didn't mean no harm. Mr. Jennings heard the ranch might be available, is all. The Sullivan Ranch is not for sale, Eleanor stated firmly. Not now. Not ever. And I would appreciate it if you would spread that message as enthusiastically as you've spread your mischaracterizations of this afternoon's encounter. Martha looked torn between horror at Eleanor's boldness and reluctant admiration. Harris merely scowled, grabbing his hat from the rack by the door. "Come on, Colby," he muttered to the young rider. "Waste of time talking to these women." After they departed, Martha shook her head in dismay. "Eleanor Winters, I have never met a woman more determined to court disaster. First Daniel Sullivan, now Will Harris and Luther Jennings. You're collecting enemies faster than a honeypot collects flies." Despite the gravity of the situation, Eleanor found herself smiling at the innkeeper's colorful assessment. "I didn't seek this confrontation, Martha." "No, but you didn't shy from it either." Martha sighed heavily. "There's coffee in the kitchen. I suspect you could use a cup after your eventful day." In the warm kitchen, away from curious eyes and wagging tongues, Eleanor sipped the strong coffee Martha provided, relaying the details of the encounter at the ranch. "Luther Jennings is bad business," Martha warned. "He's been trying to buy up land all through the territory. Some say he doesn't take rejection well. Do you think he's dangerous?" Martha considered the question. "Not in the way Daniel Sullivan is dangerous," she said finally. "Daniel's like a cornered wolf. He'll fight if threatened, but he'd rather be left alone. Jennings is more like a snake. Cold-blooded, patient, strikes when you least expect it." The assessment sent a chill through Eleanor, despite the warm kitchen and hot coffee. "What should we do?" "Be vigilant," Martha advised, "and perhaps mention it to Sheriff Dawson tomorrow." Eleanor nodded, though privately she wondered how much help the sheriff would be. His attitude toward Daniel seemed complicated, not openly hostile like Harris, but not particularly sympathetic either. As she prepared for bed that night, Eleanor's mind returned to Sarah's revelation about Rebecca Fletcher's dizzy spells. If others in town knew or suspected this information, why had they allowed Daniel to shoulder the blame all these years? The injustice of it kindled a quiet anger in her heart and a growing determination to uncover the full truth, whatever it might be. Outside, the storm continued its assault on Pinewood Creek, lightning illuminating the rain-slick street in sporadic bursts. Eleanor drew the curtains against the night and opened her journal, recording the day's events as she had each evening since arriving in Montana. At the bottom of the page, she added a single question that would guide her actions in the days to come. Who really benefits from Daniel Sullivan's isolation? The spring social at Pinewood Creek's schoolhouse was a modest affair by Boston standards, but Eleanor found herself enjoying the simple pleasures it offered. Colorful paper chains decorated the schoolroom's rafters, wildflowers brightened each table, and the aroma of fresh-baked pies mingled with the scent of coffee brewing on the large stove. At Sarah's insistence, Eleanor had helped with preparations that morning, arranging flowers and setting out plates, while the younger woman directed operations with surprising authority. Now, as afternoon sunlight streamed through the schoolhouse windows, Eleanor stood by the refreshment table, observing the gathering with interest. Most of Pinewood Creek's residents had turned out for the event, dressed in their Sunday best, despite it being a Saturday. Children darted between clusters of adults, their laughter providing a welcome counterpoint to the more reserved conversations of their parents. A trio of local musicians, 2 fiddlers and a banjo player, provided lively tunes from the corner. "Not quite a Boston social, I imagine," Sarah commented, appearing at Eleanor's side with 2 cups of punch. Eleanor accepted the offered drink with a smile. Different, certainly, but charming in its own way. "Some might say primitive," Sarah teased. "Some might," Eleanor agreed, "but they'd be missing the appeal of simplicity." In truth, Eleanor found the gathering refreshingly unpretentious compared to the rigid social affairs she'd attended in Boston. Here, ranch hands mingled with merchants, children played underfoot without constant shushing, and conversations seemed genuine rather than carefully crafted performances. "Sarah Jenkins, you've outdone yourself," declared Sheriff Dawson, approaching with a plate of cookies in hand. "Best spring social we've had in years." Sarah beamed at the compliment. "Thank Eleanor. The decorations were her idea." The sheriff turned his attention to Eleanor, his expression growing more reserved. "Ms. Winters, didn't expect to see you here today." "Sarah was kind enough to invite me," Eleanor replied evenly. An awkward silence fell between them until Sarah excused herself to attend to a minor catastrophe involving a punch and a young boy's new shirt. Left alone with the sheriff, Eleanor sipped her drink, waiting. "Heard about your encounter with Luther Jennings," Dawson said finally. "Harris claims you pulled a gun on him." "Mr. Harris has a creative interpretation of events," Eleanor responded. "Mr. Jennings and his associates made an unwelcome offer for the Sullivan Ranch and refused to leave when asked. I merely ensured they understood our refusal." The sheriff's mustache twitched, possibly concealing a smile. "That's so? Well, be careful around Jennings. He's not the forgiving type." "So I've been told." Eleanor set down her empty cup. "Sheriff, may I ask you something?" Dawson nodded warily. "What do you know about Rebecca Fletcher's health before her death?" The question clearly caught him off guard. His eyes narrowed as he studied her face. "Her health? She was a healthy young woman, far as I know. Why do you ask?" "I've heard she suffered from dizzy spells since childhood," Eleanor pressed. "Is that true?" The sheriff's expression shuttered. "Where did you hear that?" "Is it true?" Eleanor repeated, not willing to implicate Sarah. Dawson sighed, glancing around to ensure they weren't overheard. "There were rumors. Nothing confirmed. Did you investigate them when Daniel claimed she fell from her horse?" A flash of discomfort crossed the sheriff's features. "Ms. Winters, that tragedy happened 5 years ago. Rebecca Fletcher is buried, and Daniel Sullivan has been judged by this community." "But not in a court of law," Eleanor pointed out. "If there was evidence supporting his account—" "Evidence?" Dawson scoffed. "Fletcher is the most powerful man in the county. Even if there was evidence, who'd stand against him? You've been here long enough to understand how things work in small towns." Before Eleanor could respond, the schoolhouse door swung open with such force it banged against the wall. Conversation died as Luther Jennings strode in, flanked by Will Harris and 2 men Eleanor didn't recognize. The pockmarked man's gaze swept the room before landing on her, his mouth curving into an unpleasant smile. "Don't look now," Dawson muttered, "but your friend has arrived." "He's no friend of mine," Eleanor replied quietly. Jennings made his way through the crowd, stopping to exchange words with several townspeople who seemed distinctly uncomfortable with his presence. When he reached Eleanor and the sheriff, he removed his hat with exaggerated courtesy. "Sheriff Dawson," he drawled. "Ms. Winters, pleasure to see you both in more civilized circumstances than our last meeting." Sheriff Dawson nodded stiffly. "Jennings, didn't know you had an interest in school functions." "Just being neighborly," Jennings replied. "Thinking of settling in these parts. Need to get acquainted with the community." His small eyes never left Eleanor's face as he spoke, a clear challenge. In his gaze, she met it steadily, refusing to be intimidated despite the unease growing in her stomach. "If you'll excuse me," she said coolly, "I promised to help Sarah with the desserts." As she turned to go, Jennings caught her elbow. "Now, don't rush off, Ms. Winters. We have business to discuss." Sheriff Dawson stepped forward. "Let go of the Lady Jennings." "Just being friendly," Jennings protested, though he released Eleanor's arm. "Wanted to inform Ms. Winters that my offer for Sullivan Ranch still stands. In fact, I'm willing to increase it to $600. "As I told you before, the ranch is not for sale," Eleanor stated firmly. Jennings smiled, revealing tobacco-stained teeth. "Everything has a price, ma'am. It's just a matter of finding it." "Not everything," she countered, "and certainly not Sullivan Ranch." A flicker of anger crossed Jennings' face before he controlled it. "We'll see about that. Sullivan's reputation won't protect that land forever." He replaced his hat. "Think of it, Miss Winters. Opportunity seldom knocks twice." He moved away, rejoining his companions near the punch bowl. Eleanor released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "That man gives me a chill," she admitted to Sheriff Dawson. "As well he should," the sheriff replied grimly. "Luther Jennings doesn't make idle threats." Eleanor spent the remainder of the social on edge, aware of Jennings's gaze following her as she helped serve desserts and conversed with those few townspeople willing to acknowledge her. By the time the gathering began to disperse in late afternoon, she was exhausted from the constant vigilance. Sarah found her collecting used plates near the refreshment table. "You look done in," the younger woman observed sympathetically. "Was it Jennings?" "Partly," Eleanor admitted, "and partly the strain of navigating social waters where most people view me with suspicion." "Not everyone," Sarah argued. "Mrs. Parker asked me specifically about you. Said anyone willing to stand by their commitments despite adversity showed admirable character." The unexpected support warmed Eleanor. "That's kind of her. And Mr. Lewis at the hardware store mentioned he'd be happy to extend credit for building supplies for the ranch," Sarah added. "Said any business partner of Thomas Sullivan's brother was good enough for him." These small gestures of acceptance meant more to Eleanor than she could express. After weeks of cold shoulders and whispers, the knowledge that at least some of Pinewood Creek's residents viewed her with something other than suspicion lifted her spirits considerably. "Thank you for inviting me today," she told Sarah sincerely. "It was enlightening." As Eleanor departed the schoolhouse, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the dusty street. She was halfway to the inn when the sound of footsteps behind her caused her to turn. Luther Jennings stood there, hat in hand, a smile that didn't reach his eyes fixed firmly in place. "A word, Miss Winters," he said, his tone making it clear this wasn't a request. Eleanor glanced around, noting with dismay that the street was nearly empty, most townsfolk having retreated to their homes for supper. "I have nothing further to say to you, Mr. Jennings." "Hear me out," he insisted, stepping closer. "I'm a reasonable man. I understand loyalty. But you're backing a losing horse with Sullivan." "I don't know what you mean." Jennings's smile widened. "Sure you do. Town's just waiting for an excuse to run Sullivan out for good. Man like that, with his history, one more incident is all it'll take." An icy fear gripped Eleanor's heart. "Are you threatening Daniel?" "Threatening? No, ma'am. Just stating facts." Jennings twirled his hat in his hands. "Bad things happen to men with enemies, especially men who live alone, isolated like." The implication was unmistakable. Eleanor straightened her spine, fixing Jennings with a glare that had cowed more than one adversary in Boston's courtrooms where she'd assisted her father. "Listen carefully, Mr. Jennings, because I won't repeat myself. Any harm that comes to Daniel Sullivan will be investigated thoroughly, regardless of what this town might believe about his past. I have connections in Boston, legal connections, who would take great interest in suspicious activities surrounding valuable property." It was a bluff, but delivered with such conviction that uncertainty flickered across Jennings's face. "Furthermore," Eleanor continued, her voice steady despite her racing heart, "I've taken the precaution of writing to my father's law partners about our encounter at the ranch and your unusual interest in Sullivan property. Should anything untoward occur, they have instructions to pursue the matter vigorously." Jennings studied her for a long moment, his small eyes calculating. "You're either the bravest or the most foolish woman I've ever met, Ms. Winters." "Perhaps both," she conceded. "But I protect what's mine, Mr. Jennings. Remember that." With that, she turned and continued toward the inn, fighting the urge to look back. Only when she reached the safety of the porch did she allow herself a moment of weakness, her hands trembling as she gripped the railing for support. Martha found her there minutes later, staring unseeing at the street. "Everything all right, dear? You look pale as a ghost." Eleanor managed a weak smile. "Just tired from socializing." The innkeeper's shrewd eyes suggested she wasn't convinced, but she merely nodded. "Come inside. Supper's nearly ready, and you look like you could use a hot meal." That night, sleep eluded Eleanor. She lay awake, replaying her confrontation with Jennings and weighing her options. The threat to Daniel had been thinly veiled but unmistakable. Should she warn him? And if so, what could either of them do against a man like Jennings, who clearly had both resources and determination on his side? Dawn found her still wrestling with these questions. She dressed with care, her movements mechanical as her mind continued to race. A plan was forming, risky, perhaps even foolhardy, but the only course of action that might provide the answers she sought. Eleanor bypassed breakfast, slipping out of the inn before Martha could delay her with questions or concerns. Her first stop was the telegraph office, where she composed a brief message to her father's former law partner in Boston. "Researching land claim dispute. Stop. Please send any information on Luther Jennings. Stop activities in Montana Territory. Stop urgent. Stop next." She visited the mercantile, steeling herself for the frosty reception she'd come to expect from Mrs. Fletcher. To her surprise, the older woman was absent, her place behind the counter taken by a thin, balding man with wire-rimmed spectacles. "Mr. Fletcher," Eleanor guessed, recognizing the description Daniel had once provided. The man peered at her over his spectacles. "You'd be Thomas Sullivan's intended," he said, his voice neither friendly nor hostile, merely factual. "Eleanor Winters," she confirmed, extending her hand. Fletcher hesitated before shaking it briefly. "What can I do for you, Ms. Winters?" Eleanor drew a deep breath. "I'd like to place an order for building supplies, for the Sullivan Ranch." Something flashed in Fletcher's eyes, an emotion Eleanor couldn't quite identify. "Sullivan Ranch," he repeated slowly. "Daniel rebuilding, is he?" "We both are," Eleanor corrected. "I've been hired to assist with the reconstruction." Fletcher's thin lips pressed together. "So I've heard." He pulled an order book from beneath the counter. "What supplies do you need?" Eleanor presented her list, watching carefully as Fletcher noted each item. When he finished, he looked up, studying her with an intensity that made her uncomfortable. "They say you've been asking questions about my Rebecca," he said abruptly. Eleanor hadn't expected such directness. "And have been trying to understand what happened," she admitted. "Why?" The single word carried the weight of 5 years' grief. "Because I believe the truth matters," Eleanor replied honestly. "Even painful truths." Fletcher removed his spectacles, pinching the bridge of his nose. For a moment he looked simply tired, an old man worn down by sorrow rather than the powerful figure Sheriff Dawson had described. "The truth," he echoed bitterly. "The truth is, my daughter lies cold in the ground, while Daniel Sullivan walks free." "Mr. Fletcher," Eleanor began cautiously, "I've heard that Rebecca suffered from dizzy spells. Is that true?" The color drained from Fletcher's face. "Who told you that?" "Is it true?" Eleanor pressed. Fletcher replaced his spectacles with trembling hands. "What does it matter now? She's gone." "It matters to Daniel," Eleanor said softly. "It matters to the man who has lived with the town's judgment for 5 years. "Judgment?" Fletcher's voice rose sharply. "He took my daughter up that mountain at night, knowing her condition. If he'd truly cared for her, he would have protected her instead of—" He broke off, visibly struggling to compose himself. "Instead of what, Mr. Fletcher?" The mercantile owner's shoulders sagged. "My Rebecca begged me to accept Daniel. Said she loved him, dizzy spells or no war nightmares. Said they'd be careful together." His voice caught. "I was a fool. should have locked her in her room that night. The admission confirmed what Sarah had told her. Rebecca had indeed suffered from some medical condition, but Fletcher's words suggested something Eleanor hadn't considered, that Daniel had known about these spells. "Mr. Fletcher," she said gently, "did Daniel know about Rebecca's condition?" The older man nodded wearily. "Of course he knew. Rebecca told him everything, trusted him completely. That's why I can't forgive him. He knew the risks and took her riding anyway." This new piece of information shifted Eleanor's understanding of that tragic night. If Daniel had known about Rebecca's condition, it added a layer of responsibility to his actions. Not guilt in the way the town believed, perhaps, but a different sort of culpability. "Thank you for your honesty," she said finally. "When will the supplies be ready?" "Thursday," Fletcher replied, his moment of vulnerability already receding behind a wall of practiced reserve. "Send one of the ranch hands. I don't want Sullivan in my store." Eleanor nodded, understanding that this brief connection hadn't changed. The fundamental rift between Fletcher and Daniel. "Good day, Mr. Fletcher." As she left the mercantile, Eleanor's mind was so preoccupied with this new information that she nearly collided with Sarah on the boardwalk. "Eleanor! I've been looking for you," the younger woman exclaimed. "There's news. Daniel Sullivan is in town." Eleanor blinked in surprise. "Daniel, here." Sarah nodded, her expression grave. "At the sheriff's office. There was trouble at the ranch last night." Cold dread washed over Eleanor. "What kind of trouble?" "Someone shot at him while he was checking the north pasture," Sarah explained in a hushed voice. "Didn't hit him, but it was close. The sheriff's taking his statement now." Eleanor's thoughts immediately went to Jennings and his thinly veiled threat. "I need to see him," she said, already moving toward the sheriff's office. "Eleanor, wait!" Sarah caught her arm. "There's more. They found tracks near where the shots came from, 2 horses. And this." She pressed something into Eleanor's palm. Eleanor looked down to find a small brass button embossed with an eagle. "Military. Issue, by the look of it." "I don't understand." "It's from a Union Army uniform," Sarah explained, "like the one Daniel still wears sometimes." The implication was clear. Someone wanted to frame Daniel for the shooting, to make it appear he had staged the attack himself. "But why?" "Thank you, Sarah," Eleanor said, closing her fingers around the button. "You're a true friend." "Be careful," Sarah warned. "Jennings was asking questions about you at the saloon last night, about your arrangement with Daniel, about your background in Boston. He's digging for something." With a nod of acknowledgement, Eleanor hurried toward the sheriff's office, her mind connecting pieces of a puzzle that grew more complex with each passing day. Daniel in danger, Jennings making threats, a staged attack designed to implicate Daniel, and beneath it all, the lingering question of what really happened the night Rebecca Fletcher died. As she approached the sheriff's office, Eleanor steeled herself for what promised to be a difficult conversation. The button felt heavy in her palm, a small piece of metal that might be the key to understanding the forces aligned against Daniel Sullivan, and by extension, against her. One thing was becoming increasingly clear: the fire that had claimed Thomas. Sullivan's life might not have been the accident everyone believed, and if that was true, then Eleanor had stumbled into something far more dangerous than a mail-order marriage gone awry, a conspiracy that had already claimed one Sullivan brother and now threatened the other. The sheriff's office was little more than a square room with a scarred desk, a gun rack, and 2 cells in the back. Daniel sat in a straight-backed chair across from Sheriff Dawson, his expression thunderous as Eleanor entered. "Ms. Winters," Sheriff Dawson acknowledged, looking unsurprised by her arrival. "Figured you'd show up once word got around." Daniel stood, concerned, replacing anger when he saw her face. "Eleanor, what's wrong?" Instead of answering, she opened, her palm revealing the brass button. Sarah Jenkins found this near where the shots came from. Daniel's gaze shifted from the button to her face, understanding dawning in his eyes. Sheriff Dawson leaned forward, taking the button from Eleanor's hand. Military issue, he observed, turning it over. Union Army, looks like the ones on Daniel's old uniform, Eleanor added. Someone is trying to make it appear he staged the attack himself. Sheriff Dawson's bushy eyebrows drew together. That's a serious accusation, Miss Winters. Got any idea who'd do such a thing? Luther Jennings, she replied without hesitation. He threatened Daniel yesterday after the social. Daniel's head snapped up. Jennings threatened me? When were you going to mention this? I'm mentioning it now, Eleanor said, meeting his glare with one of her own. And before you lecture me about handling things myself, remember that I've been managing difficult men since I was 16 years old. A flicker of grudging respect crossed Daniel's face. Sheriff Dawson cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable, with their exchange. What exactly did Jennings say? He asked. Eleanor recounted her conversation with Jennings, watching the sheriff's expression grow increasingly troubled. That's concerning, Dawson admitted when she finished. But it's not. Proof he's behind the shooting. It's enough to warrant investigation, Eleanor countered, especially considering his persistent interest in acquiring the Sullivan Ranch. I'll have a word with him, the sheriff promised, though his tone lacked conviction. In the meantime, Sullivan, I'd advise you to stay in town tonight. Whoever took those shots might come back. Daniel shook his head. I'm not abandoning the ranch. Don't be a fool, Dawson snapped. A dead man can't protect his property. He's right, Daniel, Eleanor interjected. One night won't make a difference. The hands can watch the cattle. Daniel's jaw clenched, but after a moment of tense silence, he gave a reluctant nod. One night, I'll stay at the livery stable. You'll do no such thing, Eleanor declared. Martha Jenkins has a spare room at the inn. I'm not staying at the inn, Daniel protested. Half the town would have apoplexy at the breakfast table. Then stay in my room, Eleanor offered impulsively. I'll ask Martha to put me in the spare. Both men stared at her as if she'd suggested something scandalous, which, Eleanor realized belatedly, she had. Heat crept up her neck. That would hardly improve the town's opinion of our arrangement, she amended, smoothing her skirts nervously. But the point stands. You need proper rest, and the livery stable is hardly suitable. Sheriff Dawson coughed awkwardly. Sullivan can stay here, he suggested. Got a cot in the back room I use for overnight shifts. Daniel looked like he might argue further, but a look from Eleanor silenced him. Fine, he conceded. One night. With the matter settled, they left the sheriff's office together, stepping onto the boardwalk in the late afternoon sun. Daniel remained silent as they walked, his expression distant, troubled. I spoke with Mr. Fletcher today, Eleanor said when the silence grew uncomfortable. About Rebecca. Daniel stopped abruptly, turning to face her. Why would you do that? Because I'm trying to understand what happened, she replied honestly. To her, to you, to this town. It's not your concern, he said roughly. It became my concern the moment I decided to stay and help rebuild the ranch, Eleanor countered. Especially now that someone is shooting at you and trying to frame you for it. Daniel ran a hand through his hair, frustration evident in every line of his. Buddy, this isn't what Thomas wanted for you, he said finally. He promised you safety, stability, not this. The mention of Thomas sent an unexpected pang through Eleanor's heart. In the weeks since her arrival, she'd thought of her intended husband. Less and less, her focus shifting to the present challenges rather than the future she'd lost. Thomas is gone, she said softly. We both need to accept that and move forward. Daniel's expression softened fractionally. What did Fletcher tell you? Rebecca had dizzy spells. That you knew about them. Eleanor watched his face carefully. Is that true? Daniel looked away, his gaze fixing on the distant mountains. Yes, he admitted. She told me after we'd been courting a few months. Swore me to secrecy. She was afraid her father would stop her from riding, from living normally if others knew. So when you took her riding that night, I thought we'd be careful like always. Daniel's voice grew strained. We'd ride slowly, stay on familiar trails. She'd had episodes before when we were together, but I'd always been there to catch her, to keep her safe. What happened that night, Daniel? Eleanor asked gently. He closed his eyes briefly, as if gathering the strength to revisit the painful memory. We argued. Her father had forbidden our marriage, and she wanted to elope that night. I said we should wait, try to reason with him. A bitter smile twisted his lips. I was trying to be honorable. The argument upset her. Daniel nodded. She was crying, distraught. Started to ride away from me up toward the ridge. I called for her to slow down, but she didn't listen. By the time I caught up, his voice faltered. She was on the ground, not moving. I tried to rouse her, carried her down the mountain as fast as I could, but it was too late. The raw pain in his voice convinced Eleanor more than any evidence could have that Daniel Sullivan had not caused Rebecca Fletcher's death. He had loved her, perhaps still did, and her loss had broken something fundamental in him. Have you ever told anyone else this story? She asked. The full truth? Daniel shook his head. Who would believe me? Her father had already decided. I was guilty. The town followed his lead. And Thomas, Eleanor prompted, did he believe you? Thomas stood by me initially, Daniel said, but over time, with the town against me, his business suffering by association, it wore him down. He never accused me outright, but I felt his doubt. It's why I moved to the cabin, why we grew apart. Eleanor absorbed this new information, pieces of the puzzle shifting in her mind. Daniel, we need to find out who's trying. To frame you now and why. I think it's connected to Thomas's death and Jennings' interest in the ranch. You think the fire wasn't an accident, Daniel stated, watching her face carefully. I think there are too many coincidences, Eleanor replied. Thomas dies in a fire. Weeks later, his mail-order bride arrives to find his brother isolated and mistrusted by the town. Then a man appears, eager to buy the land at a fraction of its worth, and shots are fired when you refuse to sell. Daniel's expression darkened. If Thomas was murdered, then we need proof, Eleanor finished. And we need to be careful who we trust. They resumed walking, both lost in thought. As they approached the inn, Daniel hesitated. I'll head to the sheriff's office, he said. Better not to cause a stir at the inn. Wait, Eleanor caught his arm. There's something else. I sent a telegraph to my father's law partner in Boston this morning, asking for information on Luther. Jennings, if he's been involved in similar activities elsewhere, it might provide the evidence we need. Daniel looked at her with a mixture of surprise and respect. You did that for me. I did it for us, Eleanor corrected. For the ranch, for the future we're trying to rebuild. Something shifted in Daniel's gaze, a warmth she hadn't seen before. Thank you, he said simply. Eleanor nodded, suddenly flustered by the intensity of his regard. I should go. I'll come by the sheriff's office in the morning before riding out to the ranch. Eleanor, Daniel called as she turned to leave, be careful. If Jennings suspects what we're doing, I will, she promised. Inside the inn, Martha greeted her with raised eyebrows and a knowing look. Saw you walking with Daniel Sullivan, the innkeeper remarked. Tongues will be wagging by supper time. Let them wag, Eleanor replied wearily. I've more important concerns than town gossip. Martha studied her face. You look done, child. What happened? Briefly, Eleanor explained about the shooting at the ranch and the button Sarah had found. Martha's expression grew increasingly grave. As she listened, "This is serious business," the older woman said when Eleanor finished. "If someone's trying to frame Daniel for a staged attack—" "They might have framed him for Rebecca's death as well," Eleanor suggested. Martha shook her head. "No, that was an accident. Tragic, but an accident. You sound very certain." "I am," Martha replied, surprising Eleanor with her vehemence. "I was there when they brought Rebecca's body down from the mountain. Saw the wound on her temple where she struck the rock. Saw Daniel's face." She broke off, swallowing hard. "No man who'd harmed a woman he loved could have looked that way. It still haunts me." "Then why didn't you speak up for him?" Eleanor asked, unable to keep the accusation from her voice. "Why let him suffer the town's suspicion all these years?" Martha sighed heavily. "I did speak up at first, but Fletcher's influence runs deep in Pinewood Creek. After a while it seemed kinder to let it rest. Daniel had withdrawn to his cabin. The talk was dying down. Stirring it up again would only have brought him more pain. Eleanor wasn't convinced, but she recognized the futility of arguing about past decisions. "Well, we can't let it rest now. Not with someone trying to drive Daniel off his land, or worse. Be careful, Eleanor," Martha warned. "You've made yourself a target by aligning with Daniel. Jennings doesn't strike me as a man who hesitates to remove obstacles." The warning echoed in Eleanor's mind that evening as she prepared for bed. She had indeed made herself a target, but perhaps that could be turned to advantage. If Jennings believed she was the weaker link, he might approach her again, revealing more of his plans or motivations. It was a dangerous game, but Eleanor had not traveled 2,000 miles and endured weeks of town disapproval to back down now. Tomorrow she would ride to the ranch as usual, continuing the work of rebuilding while keeping her eyes and ears open for any sign of who might have fired those shots. For now, though, she needed rest. Eleanor extinguished her lamp and slipped beneath the covers, her mind still churning with questions about Rebecca Fletcher, Thomas Sullivan, and the mystery that seemed to deepen with each passing day. Sleep came eventually, but brought with it troubled dreams. Flashes of fire consuming a house she'd never seen whole, a woman falling from a horse on a moonlit ridge, a brass button glinting in the dirt. Eleanor woke with the first light of dawn, the fragments of these dreams clinging to her consciousness like cobwebs. She dressed quickly, eager to check on Daniel and then ride to the ranch. The inn was quiet as she descended the stairs. Most guests still abed at this early hour. In the kitchen she found Martha already at work, kneading dough for the day's bread. "You're up with the chickens," the innkeeper observed. "Taking breakfast with the sheriff and his guest, are you?" Eleanor nodded, accepting the cup of coffee Martha offered. "I want to get an early start at the ranch today." "Alone, after what happened yesterday?" Martha frowned disapprovingly. "That's not wise, child." "The ranch hands will be there," Eleanor assured her, "and I'll be careful." Martha didn't look convinced, but she wrapped several biscuits and a chunk of ham in a cloth napkin. "Take this at least. No sense facing danger on an empty stomach." The sheriff's office was just stirring to life when Eleanor arrived. Sheriff Dawson looked up from his desk with bleary eyes that suggested a night of "A poor sleep, Miss Winters," he greeted her. "Sullivan's in the back, just making coffee if you'd care for a cup." Eleanor thanked him, moving toward the doorway he indicated. She found Daniel stoking a small stove, a coffee pot balanced precariously atop it. He looked up at her entrance, his expression unreadable in the dim light. "Thought you might sleep in," he remarked. "Too much on my mind," Eleanor replied honestly. "Did you rest at all?" Daniel shrugged. "Some. Had a lot to think about." Such as who might want Thomas dead and me framed for murder," he said bluntly. "The list isn't as short as I'd like." Eleanor claimed one of the 2 chairs in the small room, accepting the mug of coffee Daniel offered. "Tell me." Daniel sat opposite her, cradling his own mug. "Will Harris, for one. His brother died at Antietam, shot by a Union soldier while trying to surrender according to Will. He's blamed me for surviving when good men didn't ever since I returned." "Enough to murder Thomas and try to frame you?" Eleanor questioned. "Maybe. Not alone," Daniel conceded, "but with Jennings backing him, offering money, opportunity. People have done worse for less." "What about Fletcher?" Eleanor suggested. "He blamed you for Rebecca's death. Could he have held that grudge all these years?" Daniel considered this. "Fletcher's a bitter man, but I don't see him as a murderer. Besides, what would he gain? The ranch isn't adjacent to his property. Revenge doesn't always need practical motivation," Eleanor pointed out. She hesitated, then asked, "What about the ranch hands? Could any of them hold a grudge?" "Most are new since Thomas's death," Daniel replied. "Except for old Pete. He's been with the ranch since the beginning, more loyal to the land than to either Sullivan brother, I'd wager." "We need more information," Eleanor decided. "About Jennings, about who might have access to a Union Army uniform button, about who benefits. If the Sullivan Ranch changes hands." Daniel nodded, a grim determination in his eyes. "I'll speak with old Pete today. See if he noticed anything unusual before the fire. You should check with the telegraph office. Your message to Boston might have a response by now." The simple act of planning together, of forming a strategy as partners, felt right to Eleanor in a way she hadn't expected. Despite the danger they faced, she found herself drawing strength from Daniel's steady presence and clear thinking. "I should go," she said, finishing her coffee. "I want to ride past the north pasture where the shots came from, see if there's anything Sarah might have missed." Daniel's expression darkened. "Not alone." "The sheriff said the ranch hands would be working that section today," Eleanor reminded him. "I'll be careful, Daniel, I promise." He looked far from satisfied with this arrangement, but before he could argue further, Sheriff Dawson appeared in the doorway. "Sullivan, got a visitor asking for you," he announced. "Old Pete from your ranch says it's urgent." Eleanor and Daniel exchanged a glance of surprise before following the sheriff into the main office. Old Pete, a weathered man with a snow-white beard and the leathery skin of someone who'd spent decades under Montana's sun, stood just inside the doorway, twisting his hat nervously in gnarled hands. "Mr. Sullivan," he greeted Daniel. "Ms. Winters, sorry to disturb you so early, but there's trouble at the ranch." "What kind of trouble, Pete?" Daniel asked, tension evident in his stance. The old man's rheumy eyes darted between them. "Cattle's been scattered. Someone cut the fence along the east pasture during the night and—" He hesitated. "And what?" Eleanor prompted gently. "Found something by the barn. Thought you should see it yourself, sir." Pete reached into his pocket, withdrawing a small object wrapped in a bandana. Slowly he unwrapped it, revealing a pocket watch, gold, with an engraved case. Daniel went completely still, his face draining of color. "Thomas's watch," he said, his voice barely audible. "He was wearing it the night of the fire. They never found it with the remains." Pete nodded. "Solemnly. Found it half buried by the barn door, like someone wanted it to be discovered." The old ranch hand looked troubled. "Mr. Sullivan, in all my years I've never seen a fire hot enough to consume a body, but leave a gold watch unmelted. Something ain't right." The implication hung heavy in the small office. If Thomas's watch had survived the fire relatively unscathed, then perhaps it hadn't been in the fire at all. And if it hadn't been in the fire— "Thomas wasn't wearing it when he died," Eleanor whispered, giving voice to the thought they all shared. "Or he didn't die in that fire," Daniel added, his expression hardening into something dangerous. "Sheriff." Dawson took the watch from Pete's outstretched hand, examining it closely. "This changes things," he admitted. "If Thomas Sullivan's death wasn't what it appeared to be, then we're dealing with murder, not accident," Daniel finished grimly. "And someone wants me to know it." The discovery of Thomas's watch changed everything. Sheriff Dawson, finally convinced that something sinister had occurred, organized a search party to comb the ranch property, focusing particularly on areas surrounding the burned house. Eleanor insisted on accompanying Daniel and the men despite Martha's vocal concerns. "This involves me too," she had argued. "I came to marry Thomas. I deserve to know what happened to him." Now, as the late morning sun beat down on the searches spread across the Sullivan property, Eleanor found herself alongside Daniel at the base of the ridge where his cabin stood. They had broken away from the main search party, following Daniel's hunch that if Thomas hadn't died in the fire, his body might be hidden somewhere on the less traveled parts of the ranch. "Thomas rode up to see me the night before the fire," Daniel explained, as they picked their way through a stand of pines. "He wanted me to come down for dinner when you arrived. Said it was time I rejoined the world." "You argued," Eleanor recalled. From their previous conversation, Daniel nodded grimly. "About Rebecca, mostly. Thomas thought it was time I stopped blaming myself. I wasn't ready to hear it." He paused, scanning the ground carefully. "He left angry. Last time I saw him alive." Eleanor's heart ached for the regret evident in Daniel's voice. "You couldn't have known what would happen." "Maybe not," he conceded. "But I've replayed that night 1,000 times, wondering if things might have been different, if I'd listened, if I'd gone down to the ranch with him." They continued in silence, each lost in thought. Eleanor's mind kept returning to the watch, Thomas's prized possession, according to Daniel. If he hadn't been wearing it during the fire, where had it been? And who had placed it by the barn for old Pete to find? "Daniel," she said suddenly, "did Thomas ever remove his watch?" He considered the question. "Rarely. It was a gift from our father before he died. Thomas wore it everywhere. But if he did remove it, where would he keep it?" Daniel stopped, turning to face her. "In his desk drawer, usually. Why?" "Because whoever took it knew where to find it," Eleanor reasoned. "Someone familiar with Thomas's habits, someone who had access to the main house." Understanding dawned in Daniel's eyes. "One of the ranch hands." "Or a frequent visitor," Eleanor suggested. "Someone Thomas trusted enough to welcome into his home." Before Daniel could respond, a shout echoed from further up the ridge. One of the search party members, a young ranch hand named Colby, the same who had accompanied Will Harris to the ranch days earlier, was waving frantically from a rocky outcropping. "Mr. Sullivan," he called, "found something you should see." Daniel and Eleanor exchanged a glance before hurrying toward the young man. As they drew closer, Eleanor noticed Colby's face was pale beneath his tan, his expression troubled. "What is it?" Daniel demanded. Colby pointed to a narrow crevice between two large boulders, was checking all the spaces big enough to hide. "Well, you know, found these." Wedged into the crevice was a saddlebag, weather-beaten, but clearly not. Exposed to the elements for long, Daniel crouched, carefully extracting it from its hiding place. Eleanor knelt beside him as he opened the flap, revealing several items: a bundle of letters tied with string, a small leather-bound journal, and a folded document sealed with wax. "Thomas's journal," Daniel murmured, lifting it reverently. "He wrote in it every night." Eleanor picked up the bundle of letters, recognizing her own handwriting on the envelopes. "These are my letters to Thomas," she said softly. "He must have kept them together." Daniel was already paging through the journal, his expression growing increasingly troubled. These final entries. "Eleanor, he suspected something was wrong at the ranch. Cattle counts not matching records. Supplies going missing." "Theft?" she suggested. "More than that." Daniel turned to the final page, reading aloud, confronted WH about the discrepancies. He denied everything, but I saw the truth in his eyes. "Must speak with D about this tomorrow. Fear this goes deeper than—" "I first thought WH," Eleanor repeated. "Will Harris?" Daniel nodded grimly. Thomas hired him as a foreman about a year ago against my advice. Said the man deserved a second chance. He closed the journal carefully. The date of this entry is the day before the fire. And if Thomas confronted Harris about theft or embezzlement, Eleanor let the implication hang between them. Harris would have had motive, Daniel finished, but would he go so far as murder? The sealed document caught Eleanor's attention. She picked it up, breaking the wax seal carefully. As she unfolded the paper, her breath caught. "Daniel," she whispered, "it's Thomas's will." They read it together, Eleanor's legal training allowing her to pass the formal language quickly. "He left everything to you," she noted, "with a provision that should you predeceased him, the ranch would pass to his future wife, me." "That doesn't make sense," Daniel frowned. "Thomas knew I had no interest in running the ranch. Why not leave it directly to you?" "Because of the marriage laws," Eleanor explained. "As a single woman, my right to own property would be contested, but as Thomas's widow, my claim would be secure." Daniel's expression darkened. "So, if someone wanted the ranch, they'd need both. Thomas and me out of the way before you arrived. Or," Eleanor added, a chill running through her, "they'd need me to sell willingly once both of you were gone." "Jennings," Daniel said, the name a curse on his lips. "He shows up immediately after Thomas's death, offering to buy the land. He couldn't have known Thomas was dead unless he was involved," Eleanor finished. She glanced at Colby, who was pretending not to listen but clearly absorbing every word. "We need to get back to town. Show this to Sheriff Dawson." Daniel agreed, securing the items in the saddlebag. As they made their way down the ridge toward the main search party, Eleanor's mind raced. If Will Harris and Luther Jennings were working together, one with access to the ranch, the other with the money and motivation to acquire it, they made a formidable combination. But something still didn't add up. "Daniel," she said as they walked, "if Harris killed Thomas and hid his body, why set fire to the house? Why go to such lengths to make it appear Thomas died in the blaze?" "To destroy evidence," Daniel suggested. "Or to create confusion about when Thomas actually died. Or," Eleanor said slowly, a new possibility forming, "to provide a reason for me to leave once I arrived. What mail-order bride would stay after finding her groom's home burned to the ground?" Daniel considered this. "But you did stay." "Because of you," Eleanor admitted. "Because there was still a Sullivan at the ranch, still a purpose for me here." Daniel's eyes met hers, something unspoken passing between them. Before he could respond, the sound of approaching horses drew their attention. Sheriff Dawson rode toward them, his expression grim. "Sullivan," he called. "Found something by the creek. You'd better come quick." Daniel's face hardened, as if already anticipating what awaited them. He helped Eleanor mount her horse, then swung up onto his own. They followed the sheriff in tense silence, riding to a secluded bend in the creek that ran through Sullivan property. Several men stood in a solemn circle near the water's edge. They parted respectfully as Daniel approached. Eleanor dismounted. More slowly, her heart pounding with dread at what they might have discovered. A shallow grave had been uncovered near the creek bank, partially exposed by recent rains. Sheriff Dawson stepped forward, placing a hand on Daniel's shoulder. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "It's Thomas." Daniel stood motionless, staring at the pitiful remains of his brother. Eleanor moved to his side, slipping her hand into his. He gripped it tightly, as if drawing strength from her presence. "Cause of death?" Daniel asked, his voice rough with suppressed emotion. Sheriff Dawson shook his head. "Can't say for certain after all this time, but Doc Potter's on his way. He might be able to tell us more." Eleanor studied the gravesite, her analytical mind cutting through her horror. "Whoever buried him chose this spot deliberately," she observed. "The creek would have washed away any tracks, and the regular flooding would eventually have erased all evidence." "Smart," Daniel agreed bitterly. And patient. They were playing a long game. The afternoon passed in a blur of activity. Doc Potter arrived to examine Thomas's remains, confirming what they all suspected. He had died from a gunshot wound to the chest, not in the fire. Sheriff Dawson organized the transportation of the body back to town, while Daniel, Eleanor, and the ranch hands continued searching the property for any additional evidence. By dusk, they had found nothing more, but the journal and will provided compelling evidence that Thomas had uncovered some form of wrongdoing before his death. As they rode back to town alongside the grim procession bearing Thomas's remains, Eleanor felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders. They had discovered the truth, but justice remained elusive. "What will you do now?" she asked. Daniel, as the lights of Pinewood Creek appeared in the distance, he was silent for a long moment before answering. "Bury my brother properly. Then find who did this and make them pay." "We don't have proof yet," Eleanor cautioned. "Only suspicions." "Then we'll get proof," Daniel stated with quiet determination. "I won't let Thomas's killer walk free, Eleanor. Not after 5 years of believing I'd failed him. In town, the news of Thomas Sullivan's murder spread like wildfire. Martha welcomed Eleanor back to the inn with a tight embrace and worried eyes. "The whole town's talking," she reported. "Sheriff's called for a meeting tomorrow at the schoolhouse, says he has announcements to make regarding the investigation." Eleanor nodded wearily. "Has there been any telegram for me from Boston?" "Came this afternoon," Martha confirmed, producing a folded paper. "Thought you'd want it straight away." Eleanor thanked her, retreating to her room to read the message in privacy. Her father's former law partner had been thorough in his response. "Jennings known in Boston. Stop suspected land fraud, Wyoming and Colorado. Stop partners with retired Colonel William Harris. CISA, stop implicated in multiple suspicious property transfers. Stop charges never filed. Stop exercise extreme caution. Stop. The connection was undeniable. Will Harris wasn't acting alone. He was continuing a family business of fraud and coercion with Jennings as his partner. The revelations strengthened their suspicions, but as evidence it remained circumstantial. They needed something more concrete to prove Harris and Jennings were behind Thomas's murder. The next morning dawned clear and cool, a beautiful spring day at odds with the somber mood that had settled over Pinewood Creek. The schoolhouse was packed to capacity for Sheriff Dawson's meeting, townspeople standing shoulder to shoulder as they awaited news about Thomas Sullivan's murder. Eleanor arrived with Martha and Sarah, spotting Daniel near the front of the room. He acknowledged them with a nod, but remained where he was, his posture rigid with tension. Sheriff Dawson stood at the teacher's desk, flanked by his deputy and Doc Potter. "Folks," the sheriff began once the murmuring had died down, "as most of you know by now, we discovered Thomas Sullivan's remains yesterday. Doc Potter has confirmed he died from a gunshot wound, not in the fire as previously believed." A ripple of shocked whispers swept through the crowd. Sheriff Dawson raised his hand for silence. "This means we're dealing with murder, followed by deliberate attempts to conceal the crime. Based on evidence found at the scene and information provided by Ms. Winters and Daniel Sullivan, we have reason to believe Thomas was killed because he discovered theft occurring at his ranch." The sheriff's gaze swept the room. "Will Harris, as ranch foreman, is wanted for questioning in this matter. Has anyone seen him since yesterday?" Silence greeted the question. Eleanor scanned the room, noting Harris's absence with growing unease. She caught Daniel's eye, seeing her own concern mirrored there. "Additionally," Dawson continued, "we're looking for Luther Jennings in connection with this case. His sudden interest in acquiring the Sullivan Ranch immediately after Thomas's death raises serious questions." A commotion at the back of the room interrupted the sheriff. The door burst open and old Pete staggered in, blood streaming from a gash on his forehead. "Sheriff!" he gasped. "They've set fire to the new construction at the ranch. Harris and Jennings saw them riding away toward the North Ridge." Daniel was already moving, pushing through the crowd toward the door. Sheriff Dawson called for volunteers to form a bucket brigade, while his deputy organized a posse to pursue Harris and Jennings. Within minutes, the schoolhouse had emptied, men mounting horses and women gathering buckets and blankets to fight the fire. Eleanor found Daniel outside, already on his horse. "I'm coming with you," she stated, leaving no room for argument as she mounted Daisy. "It's too dangerous," he protested. "Everything about this has been dangerous," she countered. "We started this together, Daniel. We'll finish it together." Perhaps recognizing the futility of arguing, or perhaps simply acknowledging the truth of her words, Daniel nodded. Together, they rode hard for the Sullivan Ranch, the smell of smoke growing stronger as they approached. The framework of the new house was ablaze, flames licking at the newly laid timbers with voracious hunger. Ranch hands and townspeople formed a line from the creek, passing buckets in a desperate attempt to control the fire. But Eleanor could see it was a losing battle. The dry wood caught too easily, the wind fanning the flames higher with each passing moment. Daniel surveyed the scene, grief and rage warring in his expression. Then his gaze shifted to the North Ridge, to his cabin, barely visible among the trees. "They're not running," he said suddenly. "They're heading for my cabin." Eleanor understood immediately. "Thomas's journal and will. We left them at your cabin last night." Without another word, they spurred their horses toward the ridge, taking a direct route that cut through a steep ravine. It was dangerous riding, but necessity drove them forward. If Harris and Jennings destroyed the evidence Thomas had gathered, their chance at justice might be lost forever. As they crested the ridge, Daniel's cabin came into view, a simple structure of logs and stone, partially hidden by pines. 2 horses were tethered outside, confirming their suspicions. "Stay behind me," Daniel ordered, drawing his revolver as they approached. They dismounted a short distance away, approaching the cabin on foot to maintain the element of surprise. Through the single window, Eleanor could see movement inside. Jennings, rifling through papers at the small table, while Harris stood watch by the door. Daniel signaled for Eleanor to circle around to the back of the cabin. She nodded, understanding his plan. She would block the rear exit while he confronted them from the front. It was risky, but they had the advantage of surprise. Eleanor had just reached her position when she heard Daniel kick in the front door. The sound of startled shouts reached her, followed by Daniel's voice, calm, deadly. "It's over, Harris. We found Thomas's body. We know what you did." "Sullivan." Harris sounded panicked. "This isn't what it looks like." "Shut up, you fool," Jennings growled. "He's alone. We can handle this." Eleanor peered through a crack in the cabin's rear wall, heart pounding as she watched the scene unfold. Daniel stood in the doorway, revolver trained on the 2 men. Harris looked terrified, but Jennings maintained a cold composure, his small eyes calculating. "You murdered my brother," Daniel continued. "Shot him, buried him by the creek, then burned down the house to cover your tracks." "You can't prove that," Jennings sneered. "Thomas's journal says otherwise," Daniel replied. "He recorded everything, the missing cattle, the supply discrepancies. He confronted Harris the day before he died." Harris's face was drained of color. "It was an accident. I didn't mean to shoot him. He came at me, accused me of stealing. The gun just went off. And the fire, burying his body, those were accidents too." Daniel's voice dripped with contempt. "Jennings said we needed to cover it up," Harris babbled, ignoring his partner's murderous glare. "Said if we made it look like an accident, we could get the ranch once the mail-order bride left." "Enough," Jennings barked. With shocking speed, he drew a hidden derringer from his sleeve. "Drop the gun, Sullivan, or I'll put a bullet between your eyes." Daniel didn't move. "You'll hang for this, Jennings, both of you." "I don't think so," Jennings smiled coldly. Two tragic accidents at the troubled Sullivan Ranch. The cursed brother who couldn't save his sibling finally takes his own life in remorse. The mail-order bride returns east, selling the property to the highest bidder. A sad story, but not an uncommon one in these parts. Eleanor had heard enough. While Jennings was focused on Daniel, she slipped through the rear door, her own derringer in hand. "It won't work," she said firmly, causing both Harris and Jennings to whirl in surprise. "The entire town knows you're suspects. Sheriff Dawson has already telegraphed the territorial marshal." Jennings recovered quickly, his derringer now shifting between Daniel and Eleanor. "2 against 2, he observed, "and I doubt the Boston lady has the nerve to pull that trigger." Eleanor's hand remained steady. "You'd be surprised what I'm capable of, Mr. Jennings. I didn't travel 2,000 miles and endure weeks of hardship to lose everything now." Harris was visibly crumbling, his eyes darting between Jennings, Daniel, and the door. "This has gone too far," he muttered. "I never signed on for murder." "Shut up," Jennings hissed. "Nobody's hanging for this. Sullivan's brother was a thief and a cheat who got what was coming to him." "That's a lie," Harris burst out unexpectedly. "Thomas Sullivan was a good man. He gave me a chance when nobody else would. I never wanted him dead. It was an accident." In the moment of distraction, Daniel lunged forward, tackling Jennings to the ground. The derringer discharged, the bullet splintering the cabin wall inches from Eleanor's head. She kept her weapon trained on Harris, preventing him from interfering. As Daniel and Jennings struggled on the floor, the fight was brief but vicious. Despite his years of isolation, Daniel moved with the coordinated strength of a man who had never stopped working the land. He disarmed Jennings with a sharp blow to the wrist, then pinned him with a knee to the chest. "It's over," Daniel said, again breathing heavily. "You're going to hang for what you did to Thomas." The sound of approaching horses announced the arrival of Sheriff Dawson and his posse. As they burst into the cabin, they found an unlikely tableau. Daniel restraining Jennings on the floor, Eleanor holding Harris at gunpoint, and Thomas's journal, and Will safely recovered from where Daniel had hidden them beneath a floorboard. 1 month later, Eleanor stood on the porch of the newly completed cabin, her cabin, watching the sunset paint the mountains in hues of gold and pink. The main house was rising rapidly from the ashes of its predecessor, the framework already in place, promising a future Eleanor had once thought lost forever. Harris and Jennings awaited trial in the territorial capital, their scheme exposed not just in Montana, but across multiple territories. The investigation had revealed a pattern of land fraud spanning years, with Thomas Sullivan merely their latest victim. The door opened behind Eleanor, and Daniel emerged, wiping his hands on a cloth. He had spent the day installing shelves in her cabin, simple wooden structures that somehow transformed the space from mere shelter to home. "Satisfied with your kingdom?" he asked, a gentle teasing in his voice that had been emerging more frequently in recent weeks. "Very," she replied with a smile, "though I wouldn't call it a kingdom, more of a beginning." Daniel leaned against the porch railing beside her, his shoulder nearly touching hers as they watched the fading light. "You could still go back east," he said quietly. "Now that Thomas's killers have been caught, there's nothing keeping you here." Eleanor turned to face him, studying the face that had become so dear to her, no longer the harsh, unapproachable stranger she'd first met, but a man of depth and integrity who had fought alongside her for justice. "There's everything keeping me here," she corrected him. "The ranch, the future we've planned." She hesitated, then added softly, "You." Something shifted in Daniel's gaze. A warmth, a hope he'd kept carefully guarded until now. "I'm not Thomas," he said. "I can't offer you what he would have." "I'm not asking you to be Thomas," Eleanor replied. "I'm asking you to be Daniel, the man who rebuilt from ashes, who fought for truth when it would have been easier to surrender." Daniel's hand found hers, calloused fingers entwining with her own. "It won't be easy," he warned. "The town still has its whispers." "Let them whisper," Eleanor said with a smile. "We know the truth, and truth, like ashes, has a way of nurturing new growth." As the last light faded from the sky, Daniel drew her gently into his arms, not with the passion of newfound love, but with the steady assurance of a foundation carefully laid, tested by fire, and found unbreakable. Together they stood, wrapped. In the deepening twilight, two souls who had found each other amidst tragedy and deception. The ranch spread before them, no longer a reminder of what was lost, but a promise of what could be built anew from the ashes of broken dreams. Eleanor Winters had come west as a mail-order bride, seeking security and purpose. She had found, instead, a mystery, a battle for justice, and ultimately a love that had emerged unexpected from the shadows, stronger for the darkness it had overcome, brighter for the truth it had revealed. Not the future she had planned, but perhaps the one she had always been destined to find. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.